In this video, I'm just going to share simple tips on binding soft and stable. You could use this tutorial to bind a quilt, to machine bind a quilt, or even just to sew on your binding for a quilt and then to hand stitch it on the back. But I am doing this tutorial specifically for binding the Hello Pouches pattern. So I have my binding strips cut. So I'm going to join the edges by putting them at a 45-degree angle to each other. You can mark the line here from point to point. I like to just eye it. I feel comfortable. I've done this a lot of times. So I'm just going to sew straight across from V to V. This is an upside down V and the right side up V. So once I have that done, I will just trim. You can always check your angle to make sure that it is right and then trim your excess fabric. So I'm just going to trim a 1/4 inch away from my seam allowance, and I am going to use my pressing tool to finger press this seam open. So this is by Annie's Stiletto and Pressing Tool. It's one of my favorite notions of all time. So now that I have my binding prepped, I'm going to sew it on to my piece of soft and stable. This is for, like I said, for a Hello Pouch. So this is the bottom edge of this. This is a directional print. So, and this is the lining. I thought I would just share one more little time-saving tip for you. This is one of the pouches I've already got the binding on. In one of the final steps of the pattern, you will be trimming off the excess corners here and here because you will create a boxed bottom. So I found from making many Hello Pouches that if I just bind the 3 sides and then one binding along the bottom, it saves me time from mitering these corners so that I can just move right along, and then eventually when you box these bottoms you'll trim them off. So it just saves a little bit of time and a little bit of fabric when making the Hello Pouch. So I'm going to start by attaching it to the lining first, and I'm just going to use a 1/4 inch seam. I'm going to leave a 4-inch tail or so to be able to connect my edges at the end. So I'm just going to start sewing a 1/4 inch seam across the binding. And this is how I like to miter my corners. So like I say, you can use this for sewing on your quilt bindings or binding your Hello Pouches. So I usually fold that up into this 45-degree angle, so then I can flip this back over this way. And I just finger press this all the way as it goes and get that angle right in that corner. So you can kind of see you create that little triangle. So then I fold it down so it's out of the way when I get to this seam. So I'm going to stop about a 1/4 inch away from this corner, and I like to leave my needle down, and I like to pivot and then stitch off the corner. So you can see there is just a little bit of an angle stitched right off the corner. Then I can flip this the other direction and continue sewing my binding until I get to the next corner. And then I will just repeat the steps to go around the entire base of my Hello Pouch. I forgot to mention, the reason we do a diagonal seam like this is so then when you fold it in half, it spreads out the bulk of that seam in a diagonal way so that you don't get seam if you were folding it directly, and you would have more bulk of the seam that way. So it is such a slick way to attach your bindings. I like to backstitch on when I go back over the binding at that corner as well. So then I'm going to pay attention to how close I am. I want to leave a tail also at the other ends to attach the bindings. Now I'm going to show you how to join these ends. And my favorite way to join straight grain binding is to pick a point and fold it in half and push a hard crease on this side, and then do the exact same for this side and meet them up in the middle. So I want to keep all of these ends even, and then pull them a little bit taut and match them right up in the center, and then finger press it. You can use your pressing tool as well for this step. And then now I have these hard creased folds in my binding. I will stick a pin right in the top of that binding and then straight across that fold, and I'll do this to both sides of my binding. So like I said, right in the top fold and into that hard crease. So then I will take these two bindings and I will cross the pins like an X. If I would have given myself a little bit more slack, it might have been a little bit easier, but because this is soft and stable, it's really easy to manipulate and fold and make it work with me. So I'm going to cross these two pins like this, and then I'm going to open my bindings so that they again do what we did when we joined our bindings. They make a plus, and I am going to then pull out these pins and put them across where I want to sew. So I want to sew right here to join these. You can always check your angle by watching it. So that just gives me my stitching line guide in between those pins where I'm going to sew. So then I will take this to my sewing machine and sew join those binding ends. And like I said before, it's always good to test your angle to make sure that it lays flat before you trim the excess fabric. So you can see that it lays flat, it's not twisted. So now I can trim off the excess and stitch my binding down. I'm going to press that seam open and then stitch it down. So now the final step to completing this machine binding for this Hello pouch, or like I said, you could use it for a quilt, is just to flip this over. I like to pull up all my edges and flip all the corners around. So I'm going to start at the bottom and again use my stiletto to help me. If you can see, it's hard to see because the thread matches. The stitching line that I stitch my binding down is what I want to pull my binding just right past that stitching line. You can see here now when I get to this mitered corner, I'm going to pull it tight. I'm going to fold that, and then you fold that edge in, and it creates a 45-degree angle here, and then you can fold that angle up. Sometimes it's easier to lay the miter one direction over the other, so sometimes I like to check, and I'm going to try both so you can kind of see what I mean by that. And I like my stiletto when I'm using this because I can keep it all straight in there. So I'm going to keep it this direction and just hold that in place. Like I said, using the stiletto is super helpful. You can hold that corner from shifting. So I'm going to just needle down and pivot and continue sewing my binding down. So now you can see that I have all my soft and stable bound, and you can take a closer look at those corners and the way that they look on the back as well. And they are finished. And there's my tutorial about machine binding soft and stable.